Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Higher Ed Live. I'm Alice Arredondo, and I am joining you live from Kansas, and I will be serving as your host. I serve as Senior Director of Client Strategy at Platform Q Education. Higher Ed Live offered direct access to the best and brightest minds in higher education and allowed audience members to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in our industry. All episodes are free and can be accessed at higheredlive.com or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast wherever you listen. Higher Ed Live is produced by Platform Q Education, the leading developer of online engagement software and strategies. If you haven't already, subscribe to our newsletter below and connect with us on social media using the hashtag HigherEdLive. For our podcast listeners, all of this information will be in the episode notes. This week, we are discussing the role of standardized testing in admissions and are lucky to have on this episode with me Akil Bello and Michael Hunt. Akil was co-founder and former CEO of Bell Curves, a test prep company for underserved and disadvantaged communities. He's currently the Senior Director of Advocacy and Advancement at FairTest, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. And Michael has been at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County since 2017 and serves as the director of the McNair Scholars Program since 2019. I welcome you both to Higher Ed Live today, and I'd love to hear a little bit more from each one of you about your interest in this topic, in standardized testing, and get your kind of initial thoughts on standardized testing in admissions, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level.
I can start it off. I am, again, Michael Hunt, director of the UMBC McNair Scholars Program, but I'm also an alum of the institution at UMBC. And so a lot of the work that I do is I see it both together because I love the institution, yet I know that there's work for us to do in making it an equitable place for all people. And so as a grad student as well. I'm working on my PhD in the Language Literacy and Culture program. And my current research focuses on dismantling hierarchical structures that impede the success of underserved populations by examining holistic critical mentoring, which is a network of power dynamic flipped, student-centered reciprocal relationships. And so the work that I do, both as a research interest, but also as a student of myself, and the director of a program, the McNair Scholars Program, where we help to get underrepresented, underserved populations. Many times I've started using the language of historically excluded populations within higher education, helping them to get into graduate school and then ultimately getting their PhD. And so this is normally first-gen students from low economic and income families, as well as students from a new phrase also that I've learned actually this week is, what did they say? Globally, the global majority, recognizing that, actually the populations that are normally seen as the minorities are actually the global majority. And so helping them to receive access to higher education. So that's really where why I started really looking more deeply into the standardized testing, particularly the GREs is what I've been focused on.
Good morning. So I came to this through laziness and nepotism. I was a poor college student looking for a job, and my aunt sent me to Princeton Review, and I started as a test prep teacher. Fast forward 30 years, I've taught every admissions test you've probably ever heard of, from the SAT to the ACT, GMAT, GRE, LSAT, not the MCAT. So there's a little, that's the one I didn't mess with, because for the MCAT, you actually have to know real stuff, and I don't teach tests where you have to actually know real things. But I've taught, trained teachers, developed materials, pretty much done everything you could in the test prep space. And that led me into more policy, advocacy, and that work that I'm doing today.
Well, I want to start just getting your opinions right off the bat on standardized testing. And I want to start, Michael, with a quote. I credit the increase in your score not to my improved reading and math skills, but to the prep program that taught me how to take the test. So my question as a follow-up to that quote is, what do these tests, if anything, really tell colleges and universities about students?
I mean, like, I was laughing and as Akil was talking, because, you know, he said it, like, you learn how to take a test. Like, that's like the point of all of this, is that you just learn the basic. And I'll be honest, that's what I learned. I learned how to navigate, you know, how to use my time wisely during the test, you know, how to, even something as simple back then was just having the right calculator, right? Something as simple as that some students, like, I remember when I was in SAT, taking the SAT during that time, that there was a time when I took it, and it might have been that first time when I was in 8th grade when I took it, that I remembered a proctor actually taking someone's calculator because it wasn't the right calculator, right? Mm-hmm. And so now that students are at a disadvantage and they didn't recognize or know, right? But again, those of us who had the prep support and knew, like, bam, all right, we know what to take, right? We know how to take, quote unquote, the test. And I think that's the major difference is I'm often talking to students who are planning, even this summer, we have students taking the GRE's prep through Magoosh. And again, Magoosh is one of the cheapest options. We could not afford any of the other, like Princeton Reviewers and all that. We can't afford that for our students that we're supporting in our program, because we rather give that student to them because they need to live. So they get stipends and stuff for the year, but we're like, okay, let's just get you Magoosh so you can learn the basics. And it's been great over the last few years. But again, it's teaching them how to take the test. And yet the students are like, well, what the last 4 years of my undergrad, you know, the school that I'm applying to only cares about this test rather than, you know, what I've learned in the classroom and within my major. And so we oftentimes are teaching our students how, yes, you have to navigate their system, and their system includes the GRE. So let's get you set to take the GREs. But also my hope is that they will flip it, and that these are students who are going to be in PhD programs and become faculty. And it may be a few years or so for them before they have a real sense of ownership over the process of admissions. But my hope is that they will also help to flip this as they begin to be in those positions of power.
I think it's interesting, these tests, because I don't say that they test nothing. I think that there's a combination between knowledge, skill, and performance that these tests are requiring of students. The ratio of those things that impact a score vary from student to student, right? The skills component, in terms of how do you navigate and understand the nuances of the test itself, right? And that sometimes plays a huge role. And that's not telling a college anything about performance in the classroom. That's telling them about navigation of the test. You know, you could also think of it this way. If I gave you 10 minutes to do 100 4-digit addition problems, right? Some people will do well, others won't. Some people will make careless mistakes because of the time, others won't. What is it really meaningful about the math skills of an adult, right? So, especially when you're going to graduate program, that probably requires a calculator. So let's take away your calculator, put you under time pressure, and test things that you've done with a calculator all your life. So I think these tests are out of context, strange assessments of skills you probably should have, but is all of the other things I said first, out of context, strange, time pressure, do they just so overwhelm the actual skills that are being tested that it makes the entire test irrelevant, right? That it makes the entire test not particularly meaningful. And then the other thing that gets me is the scoring of it suggests a level of specificity and nuance that the test does just not possess. Right? You're scoring the GRE on a scale of 130 to 170 in 1-point increments, suggesting 40 odd levels of distinction between candidates. Right? That's not what it's giving you. At best, it's giving you 3, 4, 5, maybe 10. Right? But I've been doing this for 30 years. If I went into the test today, I could score anywhere from a 160 to 170, depending on how careful I am on any given day. Mm-hmm. And there's no question that I know how to do every single question. But sometimes my performance just ain't up to snuff. And
sometimes life gets in the way. You got right. Like you just said, you woke up on the wrong side of the bed that morning.
Right.
The other thing I was going to add to something you just said too was it got me to think about the how, for lack of better words, I'll say the laziness of institutions. Mm-hmm. Because institutions are now requiring this, but they haven't done the work to figure out what is necessary for the students to excel in their programs. So they rely on this test to tell them, but most of the time it doesn't give what's necessary for their program. Like and I think of that as the engineers, because that's one of the pushbacks that we've gotten even at our institution. That, how do we test engineers? How do we test international students? Well, think about it. Spend some time, develop a new system, right? Be creative, be radical, step outside the box. It ain't that difficult to do, but it requires you to take it on and do something different. The institutions are just going with the flow and allowing ETS to sort of navigate that process for them.
I mean, that's fascinating in and of itself, because when you think about, there's no standardized test that actually has calculus or pre-cal on it, right? I tutor SAT and ACT every week, right? Multiple times a week. And I tell my students over and over, because almost all of them are in pre-cal or something, they know more math than I do.
Yes.
The limit of my math is SOHCAHTOA. And I literally mean SOHCAHTOA. Like, I don't know what to do with anything beyond that. So if you put me in an engineering program, if you put me in a pre-cal program, I will fail terribly. Yes. But I can do all the math questions on the GRE, the GMAT, the SAT, the AC. So what does it really say to an institution to say this person can perform basic 7th through 10th grade math under high intensity, high pressure, highly timed conditions? I'm not sure that's meaningful for what you want in an engineer. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's the problem. And on the English side, it's kind of worse, because the skills they're testing aren't truly college. It's taking such a baseline skill. It's breaking things down to a really, really basic skill and testing these really basic skills and knowledge in a high intensity way. And then saying that if you can't do a basic thing under intense pressure, intense time pressure, then you can't do the more advanced thing in a different setting. And that's a weird assumption and a weird leap to make.
Yeah. If you were going to, if colleges, knowing that they're still going to want to use these standardized tests, what would you say are the merits of the test, and how should they be used in the admissions process, if at all, alongside other factors, coming from a medical school background, 10 years working in admissions, we couldn't get rid of the MCAT, but we could introduce other factors that carried the same amount of weight in making decisions, right? To really look at competence, become a physician, but the test wasn't going to go anywhere. So when we think about undergraduate education and graduate education, what are the merits of these exams, and how should they play a role?
Should they play a role is the better question.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna put a pin in the MCAT and reserve judgment on the MCAT. And the reason specifically for that, because the volume of knowledge you need in science, to me, is very different than other things. Now, I also know the MCAT has an English section, which to me is stupid, right? I'm not sure I care if my doctor knows grammar. Like, that's not really what I'm coming to you for. So, right. there are issues with the MCAT that are different. But I'm going to say, because of the volume of science on it, I'm going to put a pin and reserve comment and judgment on the MCAT.
Absolutely.
Right? But none of the other tests are telling you much more than, I think that if they scored them on a 1 to 5 scale, then it might be meaningful. Right? If we change the language around evaluating these tests, if you score a 1 on the SAT, so we break down that 400 to 1600 in 10-point increments, ridiculous scale, to 1 to 5. If you score a 1, there was a lot of stuff we thought you should know and thought you would be able to do that other students were able to do that you couldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I can get that. I can understand that, right? So the performance of a person, and I'm specific to the word performance, the performance of a person at a 1 level is different than the performance of a person at a 4 or 5. Absolutely.
Right.
And given that we only have a little bit of information, we have other things to look at, your test performance raises concerns. Right? That's not the language that's used, but that should be the language that's used, right? If we framed it that way, cool. I think most people would be on board. But when you frame it as someone scoring a 1350 is more prepared for college than someone scoring a 1330, that's BS, right? Actually, that's BS based on the science of the test alone. Depending on the day they took the test, the form of the test they took, a 1330 and a 1350 might be the exact same number of questions correct.
Right.
And so we're creating distinctions that aren't true, that aren't meaningful, right? Actually, some of the work that I've done is the variance in the test, right? So if a student prepares for the exam and knows that they can handle, with a high level of accuracy, getting about 48 of the 58 math questions correct, or 52 math questions, right? So let's say again, 43 of 52 math questions correct. That could be a 90-point swing in their score depending on the test form. Same number of questions.
Yeah.
All of their practice information tells them, hey, 43 is your number. And they go into the test, it was a good test, but they did 44. 90 points lower than what they would have expected.
Yep.
Like, how's that meaningful?
Yep. And can I add to that something you said that struck me too was the sense of the performance, and my thing is like, one of the things I would encourage institutions to think about is actually, Alice, I think it was you that said that you couldn't get rid of the MCAT, and you could. That's why I said they could if they
yes, they could. Didn't want to.
Right, they didn't want to. So let's just be honest about that.
Yes.
But if they are holding fast to it or some kind of testing, my thing is, why not have something as Akil just said, that looks at these are the skills necessary, like even if it was a prerequisite type thing, that these are the skills you need. Because I'll be honest, and something I didn't allude to, what got me actually back to UMBC. So I'm an alum of the institution. I always knew I wanted to work back at UMBC. I got involved with the Upward Bound program in 2013 when I got back into Baltimore. But then the director of the TRIO programs, they asked me if I do GRE math, because I was also teaching math. I'm a mathematician, math as a undergraduate, and then I've also taught in Baltimore City public school systems, some classes there. And so I was like, sure. Be honest with you, just like Akil, I had no clue what GRE math was. No clue. I faked it till I made it. I even developed the whole program, sort of a setup so that I can have more students from the McNair program so that I could, teach them one-on-one. I got the GRE book. I studied what they were teaching, etc. I even took the test for my to see how the test was. And one thing I did realize was there were things that I studied for that was not on the test. So I had no trigonometry. You talking about SOHCAHTOA? I didn't even see any trig problems.
Nope,
in my section of the GRE, etc. And so whatever I was doing, like I was like where's the stuff that I studied for or prepared for, right? And so again, if you're telling me that these are the skills necessary, provide me with a test that at least gives me those examples and that I can actually show and be prepared. And the last thing I'll say too is with my McNair scholars, we have them doing a summer program called library, and it's a library and research prep class, just a month thing that they do to prepare them for their research in the fall. And the thing we do there, and when we set this up, we told the students, we're giving you all of this over the summer because there's an expectation. Now, you all can take it as serious as you want or not, but we know that you were taught these things. So when you come into the class, the summer is not credited. No credits. They're still responsible for it, right? But no credits. But the fall is a credited class. So the thought is that we now know that you know this stuff. So when you come into our class in the fall, there's an expectation that all of you are at this particular level, right? If not, we help some students, we help over the summer, they're still not at the level. We provide them extra support, extra opportunities to work with us, to work with the staff, to get them to the place that they are at the same level of their students when they enter into the fall. I wish that institutions would consider that kind of support system where we know this is what you need. We're going to provide you with a test to see where you're at or what have you. And then we're going to help you to get to that space, right? So that when you come to us in the fall, we're all starting at the same level.
I mean, I think what you hit on there is a couple of key things. One is, what are institutions willing to do with the students they admit, right? I mean, are we using the test? And many institutions are, which I think would be fine if they were more clear about it, if they were just admit it. Are you using the institution to weed out the students you think would require the most help?
Bingo.
And some institutions are. That's what their role is. It's to like educate. It's to certify. Right? like at the most highly rejective places, it seems that the goal of admissions is to ensure that they only admit the students who will need the least help, while they pay their tuition on the way to providing them a certification that, look, we've shined you up. We've took a great person who was already ready to do great things. We've put our polish and our stamp on you. Now you can go out and deliver our brand to the world, right? I would like an institution of higher education to be more than that. I would like the institution of higher education to value, we're taking someone who needs some teaching, some education, and provide them that education, right? And I think that's the challenge is the test actually identifying core skills to the program, or is it identifying random performance on a random metric, right? A loosely related metric. I'd love to see every proponent of the test, every supporter of the test, every admissions office take the test yourself biannually and post it publicly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Think about how many professors would be appalled at the notion of having to take the test themselves, and yet they want to require it of students. And they're appalled at the notion because they're like, no, this doesn't have anything to do. Well, if it doesn't have anything to do with you, then why are you requiring it of students?
Yes.
Yes.
Walk the walk.
Yes.
Walk the walk.
Just seems strange to me. You know?
Yeah. Absolutely. When you talk to supporters of the test, just mentioning that, what do they say when you present to them, the evidence that certain groups of students, just demonstrate different levels of not related to their intelligence, right? It's not related to their knowledge. It's related to potentially access and prep. What do you say to those supporters? Do they acknowledge those differences and that the differences are related to the things that the research shows, or do they believe that the differences are related to?
I think there's usually two different arguments that you hear. One is those who parrot the talking points of the test makers, right? And the test makers generally blame the everything prior to taking the test, which isn't necessarily false, right? Absolutely, the performance on the test is influenced by what's come before, right? But what that ignores is that the test itself does have peculiarities and nuances. I think, to me, there's two different things that happen with the test. The nuances and the weirdnesses of the test, which is what we normally think about what test prep solves for. And then there's the knowledge and the information that is expected that somebody knows. And that's the key, right? Like, expected, not necessary, but expected, right? And so if you're not aware that we expected you to have this knowledge and that the test is bizarre and nuanced in this way, then there's going to be challenges, right? The supporters of the test tend to ignore the things like, we're testing expected information, not necessary or universal information. There's no universal K-12 curriculum in the United States. So a standardized exam is by nature going to exclude some groups, right? The second piece that they tend that test supporters tend to focus on is presuming that test performance and validity and correlations and all of these sort of things, presuming that test performance is indicative of college performance, right? And they look at things like retention rates, and they try to connect things like jobs after college. So presuming that there aren't other factors that are influencing this, right? Retention rate is probably more correlated to financing than tests by any stretch. So any study on the SAT that seeks to connect it to retention but doesn't disaggregate it from finances is inherently false. If you're trying to say lower SAT score, students with lower SAT scores don't retain at the same rate, well, guess what? Those students are generally poorer. So I bet you it's the money, not their SATs, that correlated to them not continuing at the institution. Right? So test makers try to ignore all other associations and simply say, look, higher test scores, take my test more, use my test more, right? And ignore all the other confounding factors, right? Now, they're not incorrect about some of these things. There may be some correlation between test performance, independent of finances, right, and college performance. Maybe. You just have yet to prove that to me. Right? Absolutely an influence in K-12 schooling. Right? But you have yet to disaggregate that and to show where the nuances of your test aren't the biggest impediment. Right? So the test is that it's a lot of noise rather than signal. The noise to signal ratio is way too high.
Yeah. Michael, as you've been having those conversations at UMBC, you've been having these conversations, right?
Exactly.
And
so I was going to go on the GRE. So you just talked about it from the SAT's point, and I think exactly the same for GREs. And the one thing we have a subcommittee that I pulled together last year to help to look at this. And the one thing we all agreed to, and it's a simple phrase, and we all heard it before: follow the money. Right? That's all you got to do. And you alluded to it, right? Like again, there was an article, I did an article in Inside Ed, an op-ed on this in June. About a week, I sent it to the editor, and the next day the editor responds and says, "Oh, this is great because I have a piece that's supporting the GREs that's coming out soon." And I was like, "Oh, great!" So I hit that right on time, right? It was a great moment.
Yeah.
And so I waited for that piece. I get that piece. It says, when you open it up, it says 6 scholars, right? They didn't give the names of the scholars or who they are, right? It just says 6 scholars, right, wrote this piece, right? And they called the 6 scholars, or I think that's how they named themselves. And then they start talking about, how institutions need to start using the GREs and how they should be using it and da-da-da. And I'm reading it. And again, it sounds just like ETS. And I'm just like, oh, okay, this sounds like, okay, they're giving the same talking points I've heard before. And then I go to the byline. All professors that are connected to follow the money. Yeah, right? All 6 connected to ETS. And so for me, I'm like, This is bonkers. So I was waiting for them. Theirs came out on the first Monday or whatever, and then mine came out the next. And so when I sent it out to our university folks and everybody, I included both articles because I'm open to hear criticism and folks to connect. But again, you cannot talk about this and not deal with the financial impact that this is having on not just this multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar industry, right? Because again, Akil, even me, we made money off of this system, right? And so let's just be honest, it's bigger than ETS, right? And so it's a billion-dollar industry. But then on the backs of our students who are struggling to make ends meet, who are trying to figure out their own patterns. And so I even encourage my institution in the letter, that the memo that we wrote about it was that if you're going to require it, pay for it, right? If you're going to require students to take it, pay for them to take it, right? Pay for them to have prep support for it. The same kind of prep that everyone else gets, they should have the same kind of support. And here's my last point to that. Until you do that, don't talk about your a place of equity or inclusive excellence, right? Until you deal with this financial impact that is having on the students, right? Who you're placing this on. There's a term that I started using that it's called optical white allyship, right? In the sense of, like, on paper, right, this is what you say, but in practice, you're not walking the walk. You're just talking the talk.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to
particularly bad, and that's I'm excited about the GRE exit movement that we've seen with many institutions waiving and stopping their use of the GRE, because the GRE is particularly bad. It actually tests lower level math than the SAT and ACT do, right? So it's testing math that students trying to get into graduate school largely haven't seen in 10 years, right? Many of them going to programs that don't actually require math. Why was an English major, or why is the math section of the GRE relevant for the English major? Also, the GRE verbal, largely vocabulary. So when you go to graduate school, there'll be no computers or thesauruses. So therefore, we must test your recall of all this vocab that isn't necessarily part of your field and commonplace.
Right.
So it's, again, a very bizarre system that does allow admissions offices to make pseudo-academic judgment, right? It's a selection of academic skills used to generate an estimated score, which is a proxy for ability in college. Right, like, just think about all of the it's selected information to an estimated score for a proxy. Right? And you can argue that that's useful, but geez, really, we can't do better than that?
Right.
Yeah. Well, Akil, you said something in a recent podcast. Why are we accepting this the way this is? People asking the question, why are we accepting this the way this is? And I'm curious, as we wrap up here, final question, do you think that the pandemic has had an impact on standardized tests in terms of a lot of test optional policies? There's been a lot of recent articles coming out about students being admitted, rates changing because of these test optional policies. Do you think we're where more people are asking, why have we been accepting this? And why are we accepting this? Why do we continue to accept this?
Definitely. And I think the pandemic has accelerated what was happening already, right? I think that the last 10, 15 years, you've had a diminution of faith in the testing industry. And I think that it's represented the work of a lot of different stakeholders in this. FairTest has been around, the company I work for has been around since the 1980s, right? Yeah. Raising the question of how we use the test, how K-12 assessments are used, right? So I think that all along the lines, the pendulum is swinging the other way, right? Standardized testing started in the early 1900s. It was accelerated in about the 50s when, colleges wanted to prevent the education hobo jungles from letting the unwashed masses in the education, creating education hobo jungles So let's increase the barriers to access, right? That accelerated with things like the Higher Ed Education Act and all of those sort of things, and ESSA and all of those things increase the reliance on testing, right? But now the pendulum is swinging the other way as testing was being used increasingly and more poorly. You know, my favorite example of misuse of testing, which is really kind of where we've reached, right? We've taken something that narrowly provides a small bit of information and think about the language that's used about how much it says about a person, about your readiness, your college and career readiness. Like, really? The SAT is gonna predict how good I'm gonna be as a banker? Like, you know, like it makes no sense. But the worst example of it all that I've seen is a judge in New Jersey actually said, because of this student's SAT scores, this convicted rapist SAT scores, his college scores, we should give him a lighter sentence. It's past time to just get rid of it all. If we've reached that point, let's just get rid of it all.
Yeah.
And it's being reconsidered everywhere, from kindergarten, you know, gifted and talented testing given to fourth graders to determine the next 12 years of their education pathway. Like, really?
Yeah.
Sorry, not fourth graders, 4-year-olds. New York City does testing on 4-year-olds to put them in gifted and talented programs. So absolutely, there's been pushback all across K-16, and it's rightfully so, and hopefully it'll continue.
Yeah.
And I will say that you're right that it isn't new. I think when I entered into the McNair program in 2017, there was a list, and it might still exist, a Google list of schools that, particularly even in the sciences, who have stopped accepting the GREs and no longer as a part of it. And so this was pre-pandemic. What I think the pandemic has done, though, is had us look at not just the tests, but the general economic needs of our students. And even institutions are thinking about more so like what other support. So, give you an example, they just sent an email out to our institution, and they're using this this program. I think it's called Care at Work or something like that, where, you know, providing support because they recognize that we need support for being caregivers, and not just our faculty and staff, but students. There's students who are becoming caregivers even before the pandemic. But again, the pandemic has shown us that, oh yeah, like our students have family members, you know, are not just parents, because they started helping with, you know, student parents, right, or students who are parents. Institutions have been starting to do that, but not recognizing that they're little siblings, right, or family members, oldest family members, etc. And so the pandemic has really opened the eyes to see more of the needs of our students. And I think that now that that's the case, it's a prime time for us to consider how such standardized testing as a layer that's unnecessary, right? That's the part that I'm getting, is that it's not necessary. And if you really put time and energy into developing something that's necessary, it can benefit both the student and the institution. And that's my thing, is that I hope and pray that institutions will wake up and again get off the sofa, right? And put to work those PhDs degrees that they got, that tells us that they so smart, right? You telling me you can't think of a new system, right? And y'all sitting around the table, right? No, you're lazy, right? Get up, do the work, think through, have the necessary conversations so that everyone can achieve, not just those who have access and opportunity. And it's not about even providing because here's my other annoyance, that the pushback that we get to, well, ETS provides free resources on their website. No, but it's not the same resources that those who have the $600, $800, $1,000 to pay for. Give me that, then we can talk. Right? Give me access to that, right? And then, all right, cool, right? And not just me, but all the students, because I'm not just fighting for my students in the McNair program, right? I'm fighting for those who don't have what we have, right? Because we're blessed to have this kind of support for our students, and be a mouthpiece for them. But I want to be a mouthpiece for all who are in inequitable situations.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you both taking the time, and I also appreciate contributions that you are making and continue to make to this very important conversation. I thank all of our audience for tuning in today for Higher Ed Live, and I hope to catch you on the next episode. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.